Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video conference sponsored by Jewish Fast for Gaza. I'm delighted that you've joined us for this very, very important conversation. I'm going to begin with a few pieces of housekeeping and a few details that those of you who are logging in will need to know to be able to participate. The main thing you need to know is that this is a conversation between myself and Jehad Abusalim, who is a staff person at the American Friends Service Committee in the Middle East program, and a Gazan and an expert on Gaza history, and a PhD student at New York University in Jewish studies and Jewish history as it pertains to Zionism and the Jewish experience in Palestine. So just very briefly, I want to give people a little bit of history about the Jewish Fast for Gaza. It was an initiative that was started in 2009 after Israel's military assault Operation Cast Lead on Gaza. And it was really an effort to offer a Jewish voice of conscience about what Israel was doing in Gaza. The blockade, the military incursions, the increasing humanitarian crisis there. And it was first and foremost a faithful call. And while it came from a Jewish context, we really invited all people of conscience to participate in a monthly fast, sunrise to sundown fast, in solidarity to the people of Gaza. And in tandem with these fasts, we would host conference calls with various people who would educate us about the current situation in Gaza. The goals of the initiative are threefold. One, to call for a lifting of the blockade that prevents the entry of civilian goods and services into Gaza. Two, to provide humanitarian and developmental aid to the people of Gaza immediately. Three, to call upon Israel, the US, and the international community to engage in negotiations without preconditions with all relevant Palestinian parties, including Hamas, toward a just resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So we are rebooting, as Shai mentioned, the campaign. Today is technically our first fast day. Whether you choose to fast all day or partially or not at all, we invite people to use this day as a day of personal contemplation and conviction on what's going on, to offer donations toward groups that are doing important work in Gaza. And at Jewish Fast for Gaza, we suggest Anera, which the information can be found on our Facebook page about how you can donate to Anera, which is one of the most, to our mind, important NGOs doing humanitarian work inside Gaza. And going forward, we will be offering resources for people or groups to come together to host gatherings to commemorate and keep in mind and show solidarity with the people of Gaza during our fast days as well. So you can find out more information about the Jewish Fast for Gaza on our Facebook page. This is the first of monthly video conferences that we'll be holding to update people on the situation there and let people know how they can participate in being part of a campaign to bring a just solution to the situation in Gaza. So with that, I would again like to introduce our speaker. Unfortunately, one of our presenters, Dr. Sarah Roy of Harvard University, who was very much looking forward to being part of this conversation, just yesterday let us know that she was very disappointed to say she could not participate because of a family emergency that she needed to attend to, but said that she would love to and fully expects to be part of our conversations going forward, and sends her best. So today it's a solo conversation with Jehad Abusalim, who, as I mentioned, is a staff person for American Friends Service Committee, a Palestinian from Gaza who has deep family roots in Gaza, which he will tell us more about, I'm sure, and a PhD student out of NYU in Jewish studies and in general an expert on the Middle East situation. So with that, Jehad, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and big thanks to Jewish Fast for Gaza and Shai. And you know, I wish that Professor Roy was with us, but you know, we're hoping that you know, her family is okay and everything is fine.
Yes, she sends her best. So our conversation today was intended to focus primarily on the Great March of Return, which is an important movement, popular movement that has been building inside Gaza, and that still is our primary focus. But of course, as is so much the case in the Middle East, things are changing all the time. And just these last few days, we have been learning about Israeli bombing and military attacks on Gaza. And so we thought it would be helpful just to begin there to get a little bit of a sense from you before we talk more about our regularly scheduled subject, to give us a little bit of your sense and perspective on what's been happening in Gaza the last few days.
Sure. The situation in Gaza, unfortunately, over the past few days have been going towards escalation. I mean, thankfully, there has been a ceasefire that has been agreed upon and mediated by Egypt between the Palestinian factions in Gaza and Israel. And over the past 3 days, the Israeli military bombed various targets in Gaza, and the situation evolved into an exchange of fire between the Palestinian factions and Israel, following a long series of Israeli provocations that not only violate the 2014 ceasefire agreement, but also constitute or add to the ongoing violence of the blockade that Gaza has been suffering from over the past 11 years, and the military occupation that negatively affects every aspect of people's lives in Gaza. So since 2014, Israeli military actually on occasional basis performs various kinds of military targeting, shelling, shooting at fishermen, all sorts of provocations that to their credit, the Palestinian factions in Gaza have met with a lot of restraint, and they prioritized quiet and maintenance of the ceasefire agreement over any form of retaliation. But following the massacre of the Great March of Return and the killing of 120, more than 100 people in Gaza, and the injuring of hundreds, if not thousands, of people, it's become very politically difficult for the Palestinian factions in Gaza not to perform any form of retaliation against Israeli provocations and attacks, especially that these factions have recognized that a large segment of the Palestinian people in Gaza and beyond wanted to exercise its political will through the means of mass popular mobilization, as we saw on the Great Return March. And despite all the harm that befell on the civilian protesters over the past few weeks, the Palestinian factions in Gaza did not engage in any form of retaliation. But in around the Bloody Monday, the day of the embassy move, where 60 people, more than 60 people, have been killed, and throughout the weeks of the Great Return March, and even before Great Return March, I mean, we're talking about provocations that the most recent ones that started from mid-March on, and despite that, the Palestinian factions wanted to commit to self-restraint. And but like I said, over the past few days, it's become very difficult for them, especially after the setback that befell on the Great Return March, because, like I will explain shortly, the Great Return March was a tactic and a method that was a product of a large discussion in Palestinian political arena that enabled such method to be adopted by large sectors of Palestinians. The fact that this nonviolent and peaceful march was met by such brutality is the main reason why now we're heading towards some sort of a military escalation.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you about the history and background of the Great March of Return. But before we do that, I thought it would be helpful and interesting for our listeners to learn a little bit about you, Jehad, and your own personal history and background as a Palestinian from Gaza.
Okay, where do I begin? My family, I was born to a family that comes from a small town in the middle of the Gaza Strip called Deir al-Balah, which literally translates into the monastery of dates. And yes, we have high quality dates in my town. Hopefully when the blockade is lifted, people can go visit and enjoy the beach and also eat dates. But yeah, my family comes from this town. We lived there for time immemorial, and my parents left Palestine after the 1967 occupation, given the deteriorating situation on many levels, especially for those who wanted to be politically active. So they joined into the Palestinian diaspora experience, which was dictated by the fact that we were under occupation, not out of any like normal human migration activity. And I was born in Morocco in the 80s, and then after following the Oslo Agreement, my parents decided that they want to go back to our town in Gaza and live near our family and build a life and so on. And we returned, and my father built a house on our land, which unfortunately was next to a settlement. So I was in the 5th grade when the second Intifada, the second uprising, started. And this was a very important event in my life because I become to witness violence in its crudest forms for the first time in my life as a child, growing up next to a settlement, and then watching while growing up and making sense of the world around me and building my worldview and understanding and my perception of myself and the others around me. That happened in a context of non-stop and constant violence. There were the settlements, the events of the Second Intifada, leading to the elections in 2006, in which Hamas was democratically elected, and then followed by a Palestinian inner fight between Hamas and Fatah, which of course international forces played a role in, and then in 2007, when I finished high school, that was the year the siege started. So the year I finished high school and I decided I'm going to college was the year the same year the blockade on Gaza began. And this next episode in my life as a young man who has a little bit of more independence in his life, away from family and building his own political.
You can talk. I have.
This was for me a very hard moment, and of course, for the rest of people in Gaza, because our experience under the blockade would become to define how we approach every aspect of our life. So living under the blockade and not being able to travel, not being able to access the outside world, and not being able to live your life normally in a time where there is more access to knowledge, there is more access to like social media basically makes you see how other people live, so you become to question and want to challenge this reality that has befell upon you. So this made me interested in pursuing an academic career in which I would become capable of making sense of the situation. This made me interested in learning Hebrew and improving my English and engaging in these conversations. And I ended up applying for a PhD program at New York University, in which I study history and Israel studies. But my main focus has been Gaza and the pre-1948 Palestinian and Arab writings on the Zionist project and anti-Semitism in Europe. So I'm trying to connect all these dots intellectually, but also based on my subjective experience growing up in the reality of occupation and experiencing that violence. And it's been a very challenging task to do, given the continuous and non-stop violence that has been that the people of Gaza have been facing, which constitutes a huge challenge for us as individuals too, who are even living outside. I mean, at the end of the day, you have family there, you have friends there, you relate personally to this place, and studying it, understanding it, and talking about it to non-Palestinians and to other Palestinians from other parts of Palestine and in the diaspora has not been an easy task, because you're constantly challenged, you're constantly asked to be some sort of a spokesperson about this or that topic or this or that event. But I've become to appreciate the space in the US and the importance of talking about Palestine and talking about the Gaza experience as a major component of the Palestinian experience to a US audience, because in my humble opinion, Gaza summarizes the most intense aspects of our experience under occupation, and as you know, as a nation that has had its society and politics destroyed in 1948.
Thank you. And I just want our listeners to know, one of the things I've appreciated about getting to know Jehad and I work together at the Chicago office of AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, and to be able to have someone who has deep roots in Gaza and has friends and family there and hears on a regular basis from what is actually going on there, in addition to Twitter contacts and social media contacts, to be able to give a deeper, broader, more realistic sense of what's really going on as a counterpoint to the Hasbara, the propagandistic media, Israeli and American media reports, I think has been enormously important. And for me, and is one of the primary reasons, Jehad, why we wanted to be able to feature you in this conversation too, is to allow your perspective and your sense of connection and knowledge a greater audience as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, given all of that, can you tell us a little bit about the Great March of Return? For most Americans and most people throughout the world, it's something they only recently heard about. But in fact, this has been a movement that's been building for quite some time. And I know you've been in touch with many, many people who have been instrumental in this movement. So could you give us a little bit of a sense of the historic background of the march that will bring us up to date?
Sure. I mean, let's start by saying this. Palestinian, the method of mass popular mobilization, civil disobedience, nonviolence, peaceful protest, is not novel or new to the Palestinian experience of resistance against the occupation. I mean, the first Intifada that started in 1987, the first uprising, set actually a great example of what nonviolent and peaceful and resistance that seriously consider civil disobedience and defending culture and building sustainable communities and building networks on the ground and people supporting each other mean. And this was a very important moment that basically gave life again to the Palestinian national movement and to the Palestinian national sentiment in a decade where on a global and also regional level, things were not really great. I mean, if we think about the Arab world, the Middle East, and the world in general in the 1980s, it was not a pleasant place. We had, the rise of neoliberalism, the Iraq-Iran war, the Afghanistan war, and so on. So that was a very clumsy global moment, somehow similar, Reaganism, of course, similar to the one we are experiencing now. Now, this aside, that I wanted to establish that there has been a long and constant precedent in terms of Palestinians adopting this method and tactic of peaceful and nonviolent protest, and that it has strong roots in our history and culture. That said, and going back to Gaza, the idea of the March of Return goes back to, like you said, a conversation that was started by many activists, intellectuals, grassroots organizers, civil society figures, youth groups, and individuals in Gaza and beyond, who wanted to find an answer to the question of how do we challenge the blockade that has turned our lives into hell, that has that creeped on every single aspect of our life in Gaza, that has isolated us for 11 years, where people have been unable to travel, patients, students, family reunions have become almost impossible. People have been losing their jobs and scholarships. The Gaza Strip, as the United Nations stated in 2012, would become unlivable by 2020. And I think I myself, I left Gaza in 2013, and then I considered it an unlivable place, because what people now in Gaza consider a golden age was a time when people had 8 hours of electricity a day. And if you tell anybody in the US or elsewhere in the world that you will live in a place with 8 hours of electricity a day, they would not even imagine what that means and how that translates itself into the very details of their daily life. So, like I said, the Palestinian political sphere is a very rich and dynamic and vibrant one. And Palestinians have many factions, subscribe to various ideologies and backgrounds, and have very different ways of thinking about themselves and about thinking about the situation and the conflict and the solution. You have Palestinians who still subscribe to the line led by Mahmoud Abbas, that is of the peace process, and pursuing the negotiations with the Israelis. And there are Palestinians who subscribe to the method of armed struggle as the sole way that would lead to their liberation and emancipation. And there are Palestinians who are in the middle, and there are Palestinians who want to constantly think of creative solutions to their short-term and long-term problems outside of the box of the existing frameworks. That does not mean that these forces or these groups are isolated from each other. They work with each other, they talk to each other, they oppose each other, and like any other political reality in any country or society. So in Gaza, for the past 11 years, young people, activists, organizers watched the creeping of the blockade and how it becoming normalized, and how it's becoming something that the international community hasn't done any serious effort to end it. And in terms of our internal Palestinian politics, we are now stuck between a Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, led by Mahmoud Abbas, that adopts the peace process path, security coordination with Israel, polices the West Bank while settlements are being built, and there isn't much confidence in this authority, and this authority is complicit in the siege and blockade of Gaza due to to the privileges that it receives from Israel and the international community. So and Palestinians also looked and they saw Hamas that is governing the Gaza Strip, and they asked Hamas questions. They said, well, Hamas, you have been ruling over our lives for the past 11 years. You engaged with Israel in 3 confrontations, and okay, sure, you adopt armed struggle as your main method. Maybe we don't disagree with you, but how did armed struggle translate into leverage that would help alleviate the siege and end the blockade and improve our lives? And this was the position that that Hamas has been put in. The people of Gaza, when the siege started, they understood that this siege was meant to make them rise against Hamas, and in order to bring back or reproduce a Palestinian authority that would also do the same tasks like the one that exists in the West Bank. And that's why Palestinians in Gaza understand that that the logic of the siege aims at making them making Gaza collapse from within. So these people, knowing and understanding the political logic behind the siege, they thought that while all these options and methods that the Palestinian factions and the Palestinian Palestinian factions have adopted have not brought any change, why not adopt a new method, a new form of resistance? But of course, because there hasn't been any form of direct Israeli occupation presence within the borders of Gaza. I mean, Israel controls borders, crossings, sea, and airspace. Israel has control over what we eat, our bodies, even counts the calories we consume. But there hasn't been a direct military presence inside on the streets of Gaza. So people thought about why not protesting near the border fence that symbolizes the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, because this border fence between Gaza and Israel, where people protested now, is the fence that was erupted as a result of the 1948 war and the establishment of the State of Israel, and the only purpose it served was to block the return of 70% of the population of Gaza to their towns and villages that are just across the borders of with the border fence with Israel. So the idea of the march wanted to address 2 questions. One, that is a long-term major question that has to do with the conflict itself. It has to do with the core of the conflict itself, and has to deal with the question of return. The first message was that Gaza is miserable. Gaza's predicament is a direct result of war that happened in 1948 following the establishment of the State of Israel, and then people thought that this experience in Gaza, living in 8 refugee camps, would be temporary, but it's been sustained for 70 years. So this was the first part of the message, and the other part of the message was that, hey, we want the blockade to end. We are sick and tired of the blockade. It didn't work. It did not achieve Israel's goals. Like, they have been somehow imagining that the blockade would lead to some sort of a collapse within Gaza. And people wanted to say, you should not collectively punish us because of political reasons. Civilian populations should not be collectively punished because of political reasons. So these are the 2 main messages that were at the core of the return march, and that the people of Gaza tried to convey while protesting near the border.
So can you walk us through a little bit of how the events transpired once the march was launched? So I know it was launched on at the end of April, and I did a march rather. I'm sorry, on a Friday, and continued weekly since then.
Mm.
And then since then, on the day that you referred to, in which the embassy in Jerusalem was opened, was a day in which over 60 Palestinians were killed. Before that, many scores of Palestinians were killed with live ammunition as a result. Can you tell us a little bit both about what the organizers of the march anticipated, given that the demonstration, they knew the demonstration would likely preempt or inspire a response from the Israeli military, and then also a little bit of the context of the day in May in which the embassy was opened, and the embassy opening seemed to come front and center in the conversation about the protest, when really, as you said, the protest was originally and continues to be about return.
Yeah. I believe that in the minds of the organizers of the march, there was a mix of hesitance, but also some hope that the international community would react, would do something, would intervene, would pressure Israel to end the blockade. I mean, as a Palestinian living outside Palestine, the only thing we had to do is to, share our love and support our people who were, despite all the challenges that they have been going through, they decided to march towards the fence with their, with their bare chests and just challenge this mighty military machine. But of course, the organizers of the march also understand that, and Palestinians in general understand that, we are not living in a global moment that is very friendly to even this form of people's movements, right? I mean, if we look at the region over the past 7 years, there has been a long and bloody assault by various forces on people's movements that aimed for change, that hoped for a better life in their countries. So, in the context of a settler colonial occupation, of course, such method will not also be welcomed, and this exposes the Israeli claims that if Palestinians chose a different path, then things would be different. I mean, what we have seen since the beginning of the march on March 30th is nothing but dehumanization of Palestinians, very desperate attempts on the part of Israeli propaganda to portray the protesters as people full of hatred and people who just exercise some sort of an irrational anger and so on. But those were people we know. Those were people we cross paths on the street every day. Those were young people from my town and from other parts of the Gaza Strip who have been leading their lives, have been, they had dreams about a better future. They wanted to live in a different reality. And also for them, the march represented an opportunity to finally claim politics in the Gaza Strip, because Hamas's rule hasn't been a rule that welcomes opposition in general, and for these young people who, by the way, they pressured Hamas to let them do this march. The theory that Hamas orchestrated the march is invalid because the march itself says a lot about the content and about the kind of messaging and the kind of the various and diverse groups. Now, Hamas is the governing body of Gaza. They contributed in one way or another. Well, if like Ali Abu Ni'ma once said, if Hamas endorses peaceful and non-violent protest, then the international community needs to applaud Hamas for doing that. Haven't they been criticized all along for not adopting such methods? So it's a situation where Palestinians now feel that it's not about the method they use. It's not about the message they convey. It's not about the kind of protest they organize, or where they do it, or how, or it's bigger than that. It's a global moment that is not welcoming of such work. I mean, there are many Arab countries that were not super excited about the march as well, because, you know, like the first Intifada and like the second Intifada, those were moments that inspired similar movements of protests across the Arab world. Palestine remains and will always remain an issue that reminds Arabs that change is needed, and not only on the level of resisting colonialism and imperialism, but also challenging oppression in their own contexts. So this is one aspect of it. Another aspect is the global moment. I mean, we're witnessing the rise of the right wing and fascist elements in governance all over the world, and these forces have contributed more to weakening the already incompetent international bodies that were not capable in the past, in the height of, you know, the post-World War II liberal order, to hold countries and states accountable just because they commit violations against human rights and kill innocent people. So it's this very it's the march, like I said once, was the right thing to do in the wrong time, but it was inevitable. People, these young people who organized, who wanted to tell, you know, the world that, hey, look at us, we're here, we want to convey our message, and nothing can stop on our way, and we want to live a life of dignity. What happened? They were shot dead, and tens of them, dozens of them now will spend the rest of their lives losing an arm or a leg, and they will live with disabilities for the rest of their lives. This is a setback. What happened is a setback. Of course, that does not really differ from the rest of setbacks in the region that befell on demand movements, on movements for change and for rights and democracy, and also puts us in a place where the progressive elements in Gaza that took upon itself organizing this march are now, you know, they proved not to exercise the right method. So other people who disagree with them will tell them, look, you tried, you failed, nobody cared about you, and now we're back to pre-March 30th. I think the movement will continue unfolding. The people who organized it are built great relationships, networked, established a culture that is unprecedented for a lot of young people who, you know, like we saw 15-years old and 16-year-olds and 20-year-olds who marched, and for these people, they knew nothing but the blockade. I mean, think about it. If somebody was shot and he was 20 years old, the second half of his life was blockade. So this was their first time exercising politics in that way, and they wanted to tell the world, hey, create some change.
Before I ask the next question, I just want to let listeners know that you can text in your questions on the text function on your screen if you'd like to ask questions a little bit later in our conversation. So could you say a little bit about what the relationship between the organizers of the march and Hamas is currently at this point in time?
This is a question that, you know, has been asked a lot, and it leads to a larger conversation that needs to happen, and I think it's timely. With regards to the role of Hamas in Palestinian politics and the ability of this movement to persist despite all the challenges it faced. And of course, you know, like I said, the march happened despite Hamas, although Hamas had to endorse it later. And the organizers of the march, who come from the entire spectrum of Palestinian politics and from civil society and from various, groups and initiatives. Some of them have disagreements with Hamas on many issues, and still do, and will always do. But like I said, I mean, the international community failed those organizers when it did not do anything that would have at least like held Israel accountable. I mean, at the end of the day, peaceful and nonviolent protest is an appeal. And it's an appeal rooted in certain principles and values, like the civil rights movement in the US, right? And if this appeal does not work, then it opens the way for other methods to be adopted and other, other framings of how do we get out of our misery. I think two things can be said. The fact that the march happened in a Hamas-ruled Gaza says a lot about the changes that Hamas has been experiencing from within, and in light of it's like any political movement, they're maturing politically, they're considering new options. They amended their charter, they removed the problematic statements from it. So they're responding to these different issues, and they're trying to not commit political suicide as Israel and the PA and the international community wants of them. They don't want to abandon their project, but at the same time, they're responding to these various issues with some pragmatism and flexibility, which is reflective of, like I said, of a change within the movement itself, Hamas, I mean. Another thing is the fact that the march was organized in the form we saw, and that people from outside Hamas finally claimed a political space in Gaza, says a lot about the kind of work these people do in challenging Hamas's sole authority in Gaza, and them wanting to claim a space in Gaza's politics.
Thank you. Shai, I believe you have a question for Jehad?
Hi, Jehad, from knowing the history of Israel and following Israel, Hasbara, and one of the things that was so different about the march is that it really helped focus people on 48 instead of 67. And also within the last year or two, the two-state solution isn't just dying among people on the left who think it's not realistic. Also within the Israeli right they're really taking on this idea of a one-state solution. Of course, their version of it does not accord Palestinians' rights. But so in the context of the two-state solution sort of falling apart within the Israeli mainstream, and that does bring a new focus on the Israeli apartheid that's going on. It seemed to me that Israel was very resonant. It was this idea of a march of return had new life and new fear that was put in the hearts of Israelis, because they've shut down any kind of conversation about talking about what happened in 48. So it's not surprising, of course, that the IDF used lethal force. But I think the huge wave of Hasbara and the lack of any sense of outrage among most Israelis, I think, even though the world sees that these are defenseless people who are being killed, from an Israeli point of view, it's you know, in the kind of hallucination and fear, and of course the buried and guilt with having pushed ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, this march of return was powerfully threatening in that way. Which of course, there's no, this isn't any kind of a justification for Israeli violence. It's just, I'm just saying that it strikes a chord about finally getting a conversation about 48. So, so my question, I guess, is there, do people in Gaza and do people within the Palestinian Solidarity Movement see a new opportunity around the fact that the right in Israel is focusing on a one-state solution, and in certain ways it makes things easier to make the apartheid argument, and also how is there a way to you know, what are the next steps for a nonviolent approach that might not lead to so many casualties, or what are the next ideas coming?
Yes, the Israeli right wants a one state, but without Palestinians. And that's why the right-wing defense minister ordered the shooting of civilian and protesters near the Gaza fence. But of course, the notion is seriously being considered by many Palestinian intellectuals who are trying to build some sort of an alternative. I mean, there have been articles published, people writing about the idea of a secular democratic one-state for Palestinians and Jews between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. This is something that has been talked about for a long time and still is being, talked about now more frequently in light of the death of the two-state solution, so-called solution. And yes, so the organizers of the March of Return, they recognized that at the core of Gaza's problems not only is the blockade, but also the fact that this, I mean, I invite the audience to just contemplate at the map, or the current map of Palestine, Israel, and just look at it and look at the small region that we call today the Gaza Strip. I mean, before 1948, before the establishment of the State of Israel, there was no such a thing as a Gaza Strip. In fact, the Gaza District, which was one of mandatory Palestine and Palestine's largest districts, was a large district with almost 53,000 villages. And the majority of the refugees in Gaza today, so in Gaza today there is 2 million people, 70% of the 2 million people who live in Gaza are refugees who come from towns and villages just across the border fence where people were protesting. A friend once said that it takes 20 minutes to solve Gaza's problems. Why? Because the nearest town to Gaza is just 20 minutes walk beyond the fence with Israel. So the scar of 1948, the consequences of establishing Israel, the State of Israel, the way it was established, are mostly felt in Gaza because the 200,000 Palestinian refugees and the 100,000 Palestinians who were already in what became the Gaza Strip in 48, who are the grandparents and parents of the current 2 million people in Gaza, when their Gaza Strip experience started, they never thought that this would take 70 years. I mean, for those refugees who were kicked out from just towns and villages across the armistice line / border fence, they thought that they would spend a month or 2, 3 months maximum, and then they would be allowed to return to their towns and villages. What happened in the 50s? Israel considered them infiltrators by law, and a fence would be erected and would be drawn on the map with their blood, with the blood of Palestinians who were deemed infiltrators and were shot at the ancestors of these people protesting at the borders, they tried to return in the 1950s. They tried to go to their properties, to their villages. They tried to harvest their fields, but they were met with fire, with bullets, with mines, and even there were reported cases of rape. So this is a history that needs to be talked about. And the fact that the two-states paradigm hasn't worked, it's because those who adopt it and those who abuse it and those who continue to receive privileges because they operate under its slogan, they know, and like deep down inside their hearts, that this isn't going to be a paradigm that will end claims and that will bring the situation to a conclusive end of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And 1967 has been great for liberal Zionists and because it basically, you know, continues with this logic of let's manage the occupation, let's keep the Arabs just beyond the fence, we don't want them back, we don't want to see their faces, they'll move on and forget. But guess what? They neither moved on and they neither forgot, because who wants to live in a world where demographics and realities are imposed through the barrel of the gun? I don't think a decent person would accept that, and so as Palestinians too, especially those in Gaza who raised the question of return. I don't think people were expecting to actually physically return, but they wanted to shed light on the notion of return as the ultimate way of providing justice if the international community and if the Israelis are going to ever be serious about ending this predicament.
Thank you. So I have a question here. I have a question that has been texted in, and that is, what is the method that U.S. Arab-led organizations on Palestine adopt in order to shift the rhetoric into one that unifies our civil society and at the same time uplifts Palestinians in Palestine? I guess you could phrase it as what would you suggest would be the method for Arab-led organizations on Palestine to adopt in order to shift this rhetoric into one that brings civil society together and uplifts Palestinians who are living in Palestine?
This is a great question. I think, you know, the work that has been you know, adopted and by many organizers now, either, you know, working on BDS, on challenging United States complicity in funding and providing impunity to Israel, and also on raising awareness and to reaching out to people and to address Palestine as an issue of justice that other movements for justice in the US and beyond would talk about. So, and I think, you know, building power in America, building leverage for us that could translate into a change of policies that would you know, help people alleviate the pressures on people on the ground, but also change the political discourse and language and the framing, and try to go beyond. And this, of course, answers to I see Nathan here asked the question about how do we make J Street / the UN go beyond the two states paradigm. I think a serious conversation needs to be had about the two states paradigm, because I think the fact that the two states paradigm has not been able to provide a way out from the current situation is just, you know, it's self-evident about the two states framework. So a conversation needs to be taken, and also to, you know, help Palestinians overcome fragmentation that, you know, unfortunately, thanks to U.S. bias towards certain Palestinian factions, has continued to split Palestinian communities. You know, the West Bank Gaza political division has been affecting the lives of people in Gaza, like very, very, very much, especially when it comes to, you know, the PA, Palestinian Authority-led sanctions against Gaza. which reduced the amounts of like how many hours of electricity people have. So just, I see that time is almost over, but to sum up, there has to be work on the levels of policy and within the realm of government and Congress and so on. There has to be work to raise awareness of more Americans on the subject, to engage with other social justice and progressive groups and movements in the US gracefully and humbly, and to try to convey our narrative. Because that in the past 5 years since I moved to the US, I've been awed by the scale of the propaganda that dehumanizes Palestinians in America. And sometimes, people like feel fatigued trying to talk about Palestine, to humanize Palestinians in the eyes of people. But I think, it's just we're undoing an immense harm that befell on our image here. And in addition to that, our communities need to recognize that they have to be proactive, that they have to work with their allies and to organize themselves and to overcome their fragmentations and take responsibility and build more power and leverage in America. And of course, this wouldn't happen unless unless the Palestinian communities here and the Arab community in general recognizes the centrality of Palestine in the liberation and emancipation of all Arab people, and also it's Palestinians' responsibility to pay attention to other struggles that are happening in the US and in the Arab world, in Yemen, in Syria, and Iraq, and try to build these connections and work with people towards a common goal, that is the liberation and emancipation of our people and other oppressed communities.
Thank you. There's so much more to talk about. I had so many more questions for you, Jehad, but we were able to cover a great deal over the course of this hour. I know that you have friends who have been directly affected by the violence that's been going on, including at least one I know of who was killed during the protests during the Great March. And so I want to say on behalf of us, we stand with you and your friends and your community. And there are many in the Jewish community for whom the Jewish establishment community does not represent us, or needless to say, the government of Israel, who also grieve alongside you what has been going on. That is an important part of our initiative here, and we're grateful to you that you've been able to not only give us important information about what's going on there, but also help us connect with your humanity and the humanity of the Palestinian people, which, as you say, has been so thoroughly dehumanized over the years. So we thank you for that as well.
Thank you for having me.
I want our listeners to know that you can learn more about Jewish Fast for Gaza on our Facebook page. I also want to encourage you to give to charities and organizations that are doing important work in Gaza, like Enera, which is one of the organizations that we recommend. I also want to mention that, as I said before, Jehad works for the American Friends Service Committee, and specifically, most of his work is focused on an initiative called Gaza Unlocked. And if you go to the Gaza Unlocked website, you'll find out more about this initiative, which is absolutely addressing what Jehad just told us, which is bringing the human stories of Gazans to the world to allow us to connect with that. And it will eventually become not only a consciousness-raising and educational effort, but also an advocacy effort to help bring justice to the people of Gaza and Palestine. So I encourage you to check out Gaza Unlocked and learn more about this work and how you can participate in it. I want to thank everyone who joined us, those of you who asked questions, those of you who took an hour out of your day to listen to what Jehad had to say. I want to thank Shai Gluskin, who was our intrepid IT person, our tech person who helped make this possible. And please, you can join our email list. You can find information about that on our Facebook page, and just stay tuned. We'll be bringing more of these kinds of conversations to you, as well as other kinds of resources, which will let you know how you can participate in the fast. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you again to Jehad Abusalim.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah.